One of the problems for the South Australian Housing Trust in Elizabeth's early years involved relations between different firms and different kinds of investments in the new town. One of Elizabeth's attractions for overseas and interstate companies was the prospect of backwards and forwards linkages within the local economy. In particular, the subcontracting relationships between GMH and WRE and the smaller engineering, metalworking, and components firms which fed them tools, machine parts, and plastics. But such relationships and linkages are always subject to conflict. Attempts to control and monopolize supply arrangements, the tendency for large companies to place smaller suppliers against each other to drive down prices, or supply or labor problems at one plant impacting adversely on others. In an expanding economy, especially one with a healthy dose of state intervention and subsidization, such competition between companies could usually be accommodated. But how firms might attempt to use the new town landscape differently, and might come into conflict in their competitive search for advantage, was something the planners had never really considered. In addition, the new town was also an arena for other kinds of investment, most notably in retail trade. The promise of a large population and new housing was enough to secure a flurry of applications from small and large retailers when expressions of interest were invited. The Trust gave careful thought to the town's retail structure. Small shopping centres in each suburb provided a convenient and accessible facility for residents, with each shop leased as a small business. The town centre, however, was based on mixed ownership, with the Trust maintaining freehold on some sites, but selling the land outright to others, including the large retailers. The relationship between neighbourhood and town centre shopping was based on the idea of planning for a hierarchy of shopping needs. Trades to be represented in the suburban shopping centres were to cater for the housewife's day-to-day needs, but would not be sufficiently comprehensive enough to make it unnecessary for her to visit the town centre. One of the main principles in the town centre's design was to provide a variety of trades which had purposefully been excluded from the neighbourhood shopping centres, which were all owned by the Housing Trust, to give the housewife further reasons for going into the town centre. Fortunately for the Trust, the ability of their male engineers, surveyors and architects to shunt women around the landscape would ensure that retailers large and small could make a fair return from Elizabeth. But the major retailers, like the major industrial concerns, maintained an active interest in the progress of the new town, and in the preservation of their particular powers and advantages. John Martin, which snapped up the largest department store site in the town centre, sought to seek assurances about the rate of town building, the rate of house selling, and most important, the extent of competition, such as assurances they would remain the largest retailer in the town centre, and maintain a maximum distance geographically to the nearest department store competition within the centre. The Trust would find itself subject to expectations and demands for guarantees, which it did not really have the power to meet. A large retailer's Elizabeth was a place of growing population and growing consumption needs, based on consumer convenience. The Trust managed a sort of compromise with its control of neighbourhood shopping, but again was led to introduce a potentially competing interest into the landscape. The issue was not so much active disagreement over the uses of Elizabeth, even if that did arise occasionally, but the fact that the Trust, industrial firms and retailers were all expressing and pursuing different interests in the landscape by creating their own Elizabeths, with their own ideas about how the people of Elizabeth should act and behave within the context of their competing versions of the town. Large industry wanted cheap housing for its workers, with itself as the effective if not physical core of the town's development. Smaller businesses wanted cheap rents, cheap services, and access to skilled labour. Major retailers wanted a city of well-waged, mobile consumers focused on the town centre. Neighbourhood shops favoured a walking city of locals selling to locals, and the Trust wanted a productive, profitable, and a harmonious community. In a growing and at the time booming economy, These different Elizabeths could occupy the same landscape without coming into serious or protracted conflict, if only because those who had the most to lose from large company dominance, the small factory owners and retailers, had the least muscle with which to assert their versions of the city. But how long conflict remained under the surface depended upon how long the prosperity that kept it there would continue. In the end, the most serious problem would be one that Elizabeth's town planners had hoped their expert designs might help the city avoid, that of destabilizing economic and social change. In 1962, with interest in relocation and development among overseas and interstate companies at an all-time high, rapid growth at the GMH plant, and full employment in the town, the Trust could quite reasonably be happy with its Elizabeth. For adult men, at least, Elizabeth promised ample job opportunities. In the metals trades, there were also plentiful apprenticeships for boys. In 1960, 69% of male household heads who rented in Elizabeth worked locally, a significant achievement. The 1962 Town Planning Committee report confidently predicted jobs for 60,000 people in the Elizabeth-Salisbury industrial area by 1991, more than enough for a population they estimated to reach 150,000. So in one sense, Trust officials had done a tremendous job. As they travelled around Britain, Europe and North America, they had tried to pick winners and had sometimes succeeded, as was the case with Texas Instruments. Securing the GMH plant realistically appeared to guarantee the city's prosperity and to compensate for the odd failure or uncooperative landowner. Hindsight makes these decisions and compromises seem much worse than they possibly could have at the time. Trust officers probably knew the risks. But in the hard world of unstable investments and other governments competing for a few mobile companies, they had to make hard choices. Few people in the 1950s could have foreseen the coming problems of the motor trade, that most modern of modern industries. More important than that, perhaps, was that by building factories and luring companies, the Trust did give Elizabeth jobs, however temporary some would turn out to be. With jobs, Elizabeth could be a city for the future, not the original future planners might have imagined perhaps, but a future all the same. Within a few years of its founding then, Elizabeth had changed. From the planned city had emerged another Elizabeth, a city of industry which ultimately rested on a very limited loyalty, and in the midst of prosperity, the two could coexist. Having allowed employers and industry more weight in their new town, the planners accepted the need for flexibility and common sense in an inevitable tug of war. But that tug of war was meant to be about details, a factory design here, an encumbrance there. Maybe the odd dispute over a boundary or a decision on timing. With the larger details in place, the public authority could withdraw, their job done, while private capital, if nudged in the right direction, would not do anything to actually sabotage the plan. Effectively, if Elizabeth could become a place where industry would thrive, then the industrialists would have no need to abandon the town or undermine the planners' prerogatives. But in 1982, only 11 of the first 21 factories would still be there. Some firms had never really carried through their development plans, while others had succumbed to interstate or international management decisions or to corporate takeovers and disinvestment. The larger companies had generally survived, though often by cutting their workforces, and WRE was being renamed and rationalized. But the smaller firms, often induced into Elizabeth to provide some much-needed diversity in the local economy, had been rather less stable. Different companies had taken over some disused buildings, other sites were derelict. Encumbering the land guarded against unsightly development or land speculation, but it could not guarantee a continuing presence in Elizabeth, because investments in a particular place are investments in its profitability and productivity, not its long-term security. The companies which invested in Elizabeth had their own agendas and issues. competition for markets and influence, subcontracting and supply relationships, the quality of Elizabeth in terms of sales, labour turnover, and labour relations. Their loyalty had to be to their Elizabeth, the Elizabeth of the profit margin and the bottom line. What would happen to Elizabeth? What would make this long boom landscape look so badly out of date just 30 years after its creation was not, however, the fault of its planners. For the cyclical restructuring and abandonment that would lead to Elizabeth's rapid rise and fall was the very restructuring and abandonment cycle in which the Trust had tried so very hard to intervene. The Trust's Elizabeth was endangered and eventually undermined not by poor planning, but by its unlikely hope that the hard edges of industrial competition and economic change could be solved, not simply delayed, by flexibility and common sense. The Trust had assumed responsibility for producing a city, but it had never expected nor wanted to exert any untoward power over essentially private decisions like industrial location. In this sense, Trust officials drew the same unfortunate lessons from economic prosperity as developers in other long boom economies. That expert planners could build and guarantee industrial prosperity in the short and the long term by servicing and subsidizing capital so it would stay in one place. Elizabeth was a quintessential long boom landscape, and that left it savagely exposed as that long boom eventually wound down and petered out in the 1970s. The Trust's planners, in their courageous and laudable attempt to build a town which brought people and jobs together, gave Elizabeth's people about 20 years of relative prosperity. Yet they also gave Elizabeth a specific industrial future, with little or no local control over labour or investment, and industries which achieved profitable growth mostly through de-skilling, standardization, and relatively low rates of innovation. The dependence on multinational firms, meanwhile, would significantly narrow the subsequent ability of the Trust, let alone Elizabeth's people, to determine their own future. And Elizabeth, like other long boom landscapes of the mid-20th century, would find itself haunted by the time and the nature of its own creation.